Well, good afternoon, everyone. Huge welcome to the Nonprofit Workshop Series and today's session on board management. I'm Christine Rach. I'm a volunteer with SCORE, and I'll be helping to moderate today's discussion. We're going to cover just a couple of housekeeping items before we introduce our speakers and get this party started. As a reminder, you're muted and your videos are off, but we'd still love your questions during the session. So to ask a question, simply use the Q&A function in Zoom. And when you think of a question, just pop it on in there. You don't have to wait until the end of the session. In fact, the session is going to work a lot better today if you ask your questions throughout. Our speakers are really excited to have more of a conversation today, and that will be facilitated through your questions as well. When you ask a question, you'll be able to see the presentation slides. They're all numbered. And so you'll be able to refer back to the number of the slide that you had a question about, just in case we've moved on to a different topic and we need to go refer back. Speaking of the slides, of course, a copy will be sent out after the workshop along with today's recording. If you think today is so magnificent and wonderful that you cannot bear life without seeing the prior sessions, you can reach out to Ellen Maloney, who will be happy to send those to you. We'll also send a questionnaire after today's session. We love your feedback on how it went and how we could make the next one even better. This workshop is sponsored by Coastal States Bank, so a huge thank you to them. Okay, and with all of that administrivia out of the way, I'd love to introduce our speakers today. We have the lovely and talented Karen Casey here with SCORE. And Karen, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Christine. I am a SCORE mentor. I've been with SCORE for about 6 years. My background is a CPA and a CFP, and I've worked obviously both banks and accounting firms, but I've also worked and volunteered quite a bit with nonprofits. And with SCORE, I do obviously mentor and help a lot of nonprofits in the area. And I don't know if many of you know, but there are over 1,600, if not more, nonprofits just in Beaufort and Jasper County alone. And my co-host, Chrystie?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Karen. I'm Chrystie Turner. I am with the United Way of the Lowcountry. I am the Executive Vice President here and have about 22 years experience with board development, with capacity building for nonprofits and all of that good stuff. So I am here to help with this board expectations presentation.
Okay, and with that, we're going to get started. So obviously the agenda is obviously how do you get started with your board? We're going to talk a little bit about the bylaws and the purpose and the pitfalls, setting expectations for your board. We pick social media as one of the key topics that obviously we have been experienced and obviously challenged, and then as well as board recruitment and best practices. So let's get started. Speaking of getting started, obviously there are a number of basic governance functions that you should be working or have done as part of your board. One is obviously if you're new, you need to complete your state and IRS reporting registration and requirements. If you're obviously it's the Secretary of State for South Carolina where we are. Obviously, if you're in another state, it may be another agency, but for the most part, it's usually the Secretary of the State that obviously handles the nonprofit in which you have to obviously do your filings that are needed. They're fairly basic, but you do need to have things like bylaws and your boards, a minimum of 3 board people, and less than 50% can be board members. I just had a recent issue in which all the board members were obviously Mr. and Mrs. and their son. And I'm like, that's not going to work. So we obviously had some challenges and they had to redo their board. One thing that is important for obviously getting started is creating a mission and vision statement. And we did have a session on strategic planning. If you missed it, highly recommend you send that email to Ellen to obviously get more details because we're just going to skim over this. Mission is basically what you want to do in a short term. So I want to create a food bank in Bluffton, Hilton Head, wherever. A vision is a little bit more long term. I want to have a series of food banks throughout the Beaufort and Jasper County. So mission and vision is important to your board because it gives you the guardrails of what you need to go forward. You need to craft bylaws, and Chrystie will be talking a little bit about that later on in the presentation. You do need to create job descriptions, even if only you have boards. Let's say you have no staff. You know, there are many nonprofits out there that don't have any staff, but the board needs to understand what is their role, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. You need to select an executive director. The larger, obviously, nonprofits usually have that as that person who's the liaison between the board and obviously the staff, volunteers, and executing that mission and vision, and selecting the right executive director who believes in what you want to accomplish through your mission and vision is so important. And lastly, there's creating a strategic plan. This may not be a big priority for new, obviously, nonprofits, but eventually what you should be doing is part of the strategic plan is a mission and vision, core values that you want to do, but more importantly, what are your objectives? You know, what do you want to do? You know, what does the food kitchen want to do? What does the education you may want to provide? What is it, and how do you want to do it, and how do you need to execute it? Those objectives usually should have responsibilities as well as timetables in which you're going to do it. So a strategic plan is a group, not just the board usually gets it started. They're the ones that say we need one, but they're not the ones that necessarily put it all together. A strategic plan should have both board members, staff if you have, as well as members in your obviously constituency that obviously have a vested interest in your success. And again, I highly recommend you go back to our strategic planning session to get more details. Skip one. So
All
with
right.
that, yeah, yep, all yours.
All right. So bylaws really, they are essential in helping an organization map out its purpose and the practical day-to-day details of how it will go about doing business. And Karen had mentioned guardrails. That's really what bylaws are. They're guardrails for your board that keep them on track. It's going to outline how you operate. It's going to tell you what document approvals and responsibilities of the board and others. One thing is that it's not expected to be updated annually, but individuals, especially funders, they like to know that you have reviewed your bylaws. And our requirement is that you review them at least every 5 years. And with COVID, we found that you have to do it even sooner than that. So COVID changed a lot of our bylaws. A lot of us had to go back to the drawing board with our bylaws and change certain things because as a social service oriented nonprofit, you know, all of our requirements were in person. Well, when COVID happened, we had to change all of that. So we had to go back to looking at our bylaws. So every 3 to 5 years should be updated. It's not something that you just create and put on the shelf and have it in a binder. You should be bringing it down and reviewing those bylaws at a regular interval, depending on what your board sets for that. Organizations should have a separate standard operating manual that really provide the specifics. So the bylaws are really flying at like 50,000 feet for the organization. And I believe that an example of bylaw sections are going to be sent out with the presentation as well. If we could change. All right. So examples of what is included in bylaws. So the bylaws are going to have the official name of your organization. It's going to have the address And then it's also going to have the organization's purpose. It's going to detail the board structure, the number of board members that you're allowed to have, the qualifications for those board members. It's going to set term limits on board members, and it's going to provide the procedure for how you add and remove board members. It's going to give you your policies on how to do that. It's also going to list your meeting schedule. You know, are you meeting every month? Are you meeting quarterly? Are you meeting annually? It's going to give you your quorum requirements. You know, is it unanimous? Does all the board have to agree, or are you majority? All of that is going to be detailed in your bylaws. It's going to have a full list of your description of board committees. You know, really gone are the days that you can just serve on a board. The nonprofits really need active board participation. And because of that, they're gonna have details. They're gonna list some descriptions of the different committees, and you should be selecting a committee when you roll onto a board. It's also going to give you your fiscal year date. And in nonprofit world, our fiscal years are really all over the place. The government tends to like July 1st through June 30th. Our fiscal year is April 1st to March 30th. And a lot of other fiscal years, that will all be detailed in your bylaws. It's going to have your rules for your amendments, because like any document, you have to be able to make changes. Once again, that pandemic just is a perfect example of having to create addendums or changes to your bylaws. And then it's going to have how, if the worst happens, how that organization is going to handle the dissolution of their nonprofit. It'll have directions in there for that as well, just in case. All right, so these bylaws, they should be flexible. Nonprofit world is, we need a bit of flexibility because we end up handling a lot of out-of-the-box situations. Your vision, your mission statements, your long-term goals, and how they are going to be decided. I'm not going to go over the example. Y'all can read that, but terms should provide flexibility for us to deal with all of these unforeseen challenges. Once again, COVID, that's the best example. We all had policies where we did stuff in person. Now, many of us have policies that we can conduct our business over the phone. That board meetings can happen virtually in the Zoom world. That votes, electronic votes, can be counted towards a quorum. All of these things are flexibility points that need to be kind of added into your bylaws.
And the other thing I would mention is what I've seen with a lot of my clients when they ask me to review their bylaws is the use of words shall and may. Shall requires you to do something. May is optional. So sometimes the smallest word could cause some challenges to you, you know. So you may have board meetings in person rather than you shall have board meetings in person. You know, that same example that Chrystie used. Be very, very careful, and especially when you're reviewing these bylaws, because if you've been a nonprofit for a while, some of your bylaws have been around for a while, take a closer look or have an independent person looking at it, because sometimes you just need that separate set of eyes.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now I'm going to move on to obviously fiduciary responsibilities of the board. And many of you should have seen the three primary ones that are required of all board members: duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. And these are, I don't care if you're a for-profit or a nonprofit board, these are requirements of any board member. And duty of care means you're acting prudently as a person in a similar circumstance. Is that obviously you're showing, you might, it requires you to show respect of your volunteers, of your employees, your fellow board members. It's a care that is expected, that it's not behavior that goes a little off the rails. Duty of loyalty is that you're acting in the best interest of the organization. You may have personal beliefs that the nonprofit should be offering services to all of Beaufort County, but the board has decided that they want to narrow that focus to that particular town you live in. It is in the best interest of the organization that obviously you support that as a board of directors to obviously what they want to do. And duty of obedience, we just talked about bylaws. We talked about there should be policies to support. We'll be talking about what those policies, the minimum policies, should look like for a board. But you need to act within those policies. So if the bylaws says that it has to be a majority vote by the board to sign a contract on behalf of a nonprofit, and you go ahead and promise that particular contract to a friend of yours, well, that sort of violated the duty of obedience. So, and believe me, I've seen it happen, and it's caused mayhem at the end of the day. Let me make sure. Fundraising. This is always fun for a board. Is your board member a volunteer, or which obviously is required to donate both time and money? Does every board member need to fundraise? And if they don't, who's going to do it? I have a number of boards who say, listen, fundraising is tough. Don't get me wrong. I've done it for SCORE. Getting, grants, it's getting harder and harder because, as I said, is a lot of nonprofits with wonderful missions out there. So you really need to find where you fit in for fundraising. But at the end of the day, some boards are requested that to be on the board, you have to put up certain money potentially every year. So if to be a board member, you have to donate $1,000 a year. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the board member writes the check for $1,000. They could get 10 of their friends write checks of $100 each, and that's their $1,000. So there's creative ways you can do it, but do you want to do that as part of your board? That's your decision. But any role that you expect from the board must be set up front, and so they know what is expected. Now, with that, every board member should be looking at opportunities to fundraise, whether you need a sponsor for an event, whether you think you should be doing an event, or you should be maybe the beneficiary of an event that's being done by a local community because they believe in your mission and what you do. Every board member should keep their eyes open. That should be part of their job. But whether they actually have to put their money where their mouth is or actually go out and actually fundraise, meaning knocking on doors, that is obviously what you need to set as far as expectations. Other board responsibilities. As Chrystie mentioned, most nonprofits, especially around here, you need a working board. You can't be sitting there and say, oh, I sit on the board of XYZ. Well, that's nice. But, I frequently have seen people who say, oh, I'll be on your board, and don't do anything. And that's a hard thing to do, especially when a nonprofit's been around for a while. Someone might have supported, obviously, that particular nonprofit for years, but honestly, they've moved into like, okay, I'm just going to sit here and listen. You can't do that. There's too much riding on the ability of those every single board seat to benefit that nonprofit. So you really need to, and we'll talk a little more about, type of board members you need and the like, but the board also approves any material capital expenditures and major transactions. I just mentioned signing contracts. Most boards require a quorum or a majority vote to obviously move forward on those. You also approve budgets, financial plans, statements, and something a lot of boards forget about: internal controls. Who signs your checks? Who reviews your bank statements? Who makes sure that if you're picking up food for a food bank, it gets to your location versus doesn't get diverted to someplace else. Who reviews your internal controls? It sort of is a lost piece sometimes when I'm looking at boards because, they don't have the people or the time, and they just assume everyone's there for the goodness of their hearts. Unfortunately, I've had nonprofits that have been scammed because suddenly the bookkeeper was taking that $100 a month, and $10,000, $100,000 later, suddenly they realize the numbers don't look right. So anyway,
Yeah, can I just chime in really quick,
sure,
Karen?
absolutely.
I think the nonprofit world is actually a little more susceptible to this one point than the for-profit. And, because we have very well-meaning volunteers and we're like, oh, well, Sherry would never do that. Well, Sherry might not be in that role forever, and the next person might do something like that. Those internal controls are really, really important. And the reason why nonprofits are so susceptible to them is because we tend to not have very large staff, right? So the person that's going to the post office should not be the one opening the mail and making the deposits, because then only one person is seeing the money coming in, right? There needs to be the checks and balances put into place. And unfortunately, nonprofits tend to be really susceptible and tend to forget that those internal controls are just so very important.
They are very important. I mean, I have an incident in someone who was working for a nonprofit for 15 years, started obviously taking funds from the nonprofit because their personal circumstances changed. Their husband lost the job. They obviously had some health issues. They couldn't pay their bills and the rent. And all of a sudden they found an easy way. Well, everybody trusts me, so I'm just going to take a little bit off the top because they get tens of thousands of dollars through their accounts, and they're not going to miss this $100 every so often. So sometimes it's the person that you trust the most, and not that you should go around accusing anyone, but internal controls should be an important part of what you do to make sure that that money or your obviously services are going to the right people. You also have to balance your constituent interests to being consistent with your mission. And this goes back to why your mission and vision is so important. If your mission is to have a food bank that serves Bluffton, which is where I am, is that, well, what are the interests of your constituency? Who do you got to serve? What do you do? If these people are don't like walking into certain areas because they don't want to be seen as having that need, then maybe you have a back door, not a front door. There are things that you just have to make sure that you take into consideration. Compliance with applicable laws and regulations and ethical standards. The laws for nonprofits don't change all that often, but they do change. So someone has to be on that email list from the Secretary of the State when they suddenly decide that, you may have to do XYZ instead of ABC, as well as ethical standards. And we'll talk a little bit about a code of ethics policy that should be a requirement of your organization. And then establish the viability and the sustainability of the board. And we'll talk about, that by what type of board members do you have, as well as what type of committees are needed. So, overall, you should obviously have, and we talked a little bit about mission and bylaws, board responsibilities and conduct. This should be given upfront before someone nods their head and says, I will join the board. I will make sure, you have to be at meetings every month. If you miss 2, you're kicked off the board. If you, obviously you have fundraising responsibilities, you might have, if it's an attorney, maybe they review all your documents. Maybe they're the ones that review the bylaws. You have officer positions in every nonprofit. You usually have a chair or the president, depending on what you call them. You have a secretary and a treasurer, and sometimes you have a vice president. At a minimum, you have 3 officers, if not 4, for every organization. What are their individual roles? And that should be outlined in the bylaws and or in your policy manual. Obviously you should be giving the board policy manual, should have information on the board meetings. Okay, we meet on the third Tuesday of every month. Mark your calendars, except for Christmas when we have a party, something like that. Committee structures, what committees do you need? Most boards have a committee like they always have, usually an audit or they call a finance committee. Sometimes, depending on the level of volunteers, they may have a volunteer committee. They may have a fundraising committee. They may have a governance committee. Again, someone responsible for the bylaws and other policies and procedures. They may have a nominating committee. So that's the person who looks for the next board members you need as you're going through all that. A board, if you require your board to sit on at least one committee, they should know that on top, as well as what their responsibility is for financial management. And then something I talked about is as far as processes and policies. At a minimum, a board is required to have a conflict of interest policy, meaning that if you are obviously a builder and they suddenly need something built, you don't automatically get that contract. That has to be put out to bid and has to be considered, and that particular board member does not vote on that. You can't have a conflict of interest. A code of ethics. Again, how are you responsible for representing, obviously, the community out there and what you say and what you do? A whistleblower policy. So if you see someone who's taking those checks, obviously diverting, maybe food that was supposed to go to the food bank, who do you go to? You should have a policy that outlines that. An HR policy is generally required if you have employees. If you don't have employees, you don't necessarily need it, but if you do, you should have one. And then internal control policies, everything we just talked about. If there's any questions, please chime in because we're more than happy to obviously answer them.
I'm going to just add one point, Karen, to the expectations for the board and looking at it from the other side of it. If you're entertaining being placed on a board, or if you are going to create a nonprofit board, the one thing absolutely that I always look for and make sure before I agree to sit on any board is that they have D&O insurance. Is the board insured? Because you are, as a board member, you are fiscally responsible for that organization. So before I look at any boards, I always make sure that they have the D&O insurance.
That is so important. And that is, that's usually a challenge when you have a new nonprofit, because it's the last thing they do. So maybe they have 3 or 4 people who agreed to do the board and they're moving forward. But if you're expecting to bring professionals onto your board, an accountant, an attorney, someone who fundraises, whatever, maybe one of the local people who are the part of the town council or whatever, if they're coming on the board, they want to know they're covered, because obviously what one board member may do or commit may impact other board members. So, they may go off the rails and you might be holding the bag, and D&O is impossible. The other challenge I've seen on D&O, because that's a really good point, is that your boards are too big. So if you suddenly have a 15-person board, you have really expensive D&O insurance. So you really need to think of this appropriate size of the board. I generally say between 5 and 9. That's just my general, depending on how much you're doing and what you want to do. Between 5 and 9 people on a board is probably about usually the average size. Now there are bigger, there are smaller, but that's the general number. Then the D&O insurance becomes reasonable. You have 15 people on your board, God save you. It's got a very expensive proposition to get D&O insurance. And I know some nonprofits who did not have D&O insurance for that very reason. So you really need to think, do you need all those people on the board, or maybe they could just chair a committee and come in and do reports to the board rather than being on the board. Because it is also important to understand that with the board responsibilities and conduct, that they are responsible. They may think it's great. Oh, I'm sitting on a board and I contribute to this. But guess what? You're also liable. Hence the D&O insurance. Someone, binds you in a contract and then you back away and that person sues you. It's the whole board. It's not just a nonprofit. It's the whole board. So, okay, moving on, Chrystie.
All right, social media. So social media, I will say, is a wonderful tool. The 22 years that I've been with United Way, I have seen organizations just blossom that were very good at social media. And it's a way to, it's a great tool to get your story out there and for recruitment of board members and for volunteers and all of that good stuff. But and it's absolutely essential with nonprofits nowadays to have a social media presence. But there are some drawbacks as well, right? So social media, if it's not managed properly, there could be some serious implications to your organization. You should consider establishing a committee that creates the policy and that periodically updates your social media and the policy. It needs to be almost a living, breathing document so that it can grow with your organization. And the policy just makes sure that everybody understands, what is respectful and what is consistently on brand. Because as Karen said, you could have one board member that goes off the rails on a social media post, and your organization could be having a social media crisis on their hands. It also incorporates a system or should incorporate a system of checks and balances. You don't want just one person putting eyes on any posts, because what you could have a very well-meaning post that that somebody internalizes completely differently than what you had originally anticipated. So make sure that you have at least, I would say, at least 3 sets of eyes that look at something before you actually put it outward facing on your social media. And those 3, should be working together, but come from different lenses within the organization, because it's not always what you say in social media, it's how it is interpreted. So you want to have the different lenses on that committee, so that people can say, wait a minute, they might take it like this, or somebody could take it like that. Because we are all this rich fabric, right? And we bring in with us our own culture and background and age and all of that kind of stuff. So what 20-something says could mean something totally different if somebody else from a different genre read it.
Mm-hmm.
And what can go wrong? So employees, volunteers, or other key stakeholders may say things that damage the organization's reputation. That happened, I think it was back in 2017. I think we all remember that video of the passenger being forcibly removed from the overbooked flight, the doctor. It started a online crisis for United Airlines, and they had a full-blown social media crisis on their hands that they had to deal with. So once again, make sure that that anything that is posted that is outward facing is reviewed by several folks in the organization and or on the board. You should also have a written social media and confidentiality policy in your onboarding materials. As soon as that new staff person or new board member comes on, they should be given your policy so that they know, right? And I always say that they should be given the policy actually when they're given the roles and responsibilities before you've even added them to their to your board. They should review your written social media policy and see if they can abide by that. Some people are just very protective of their right to make comments, and you might not want them on your board of directors. Those are some folks that you might want on a committee as opposed to actually on your board of directors. Your social media provides clear provided it is clear they are not acting in official capacity. Employees and volunteers should be free to responsibly express personal opinions on their own accounts. I say that with a grain of salt, knowing that the first thing that I do when I'm looking at potential board members or potential staff is going online, seeing what their LinkedIn looks like, seeing comments, just to make sure that they do fit with your organization, with your vision, with your mission. In every effort, you should be positively providing feedback. That constructive criticism, you can get some nasty posts on your Facebook page, but I would always take those as constructive criticism, and look to see if that's something that your board needs to address.
Yeah, and just to add, I would highly recommend that those who are responding obviously work through either the committee or the group, so that again, your response is consistent with what you have decided to do, or at least, yeah, at a minimum, respond to the person who might have, negative criticism and say, thank you for the post, we'll take it into consideration. At least they thought they were heard, even though you may not agree with them at the end of the day, but you've heard it. Also be aware, I've seen nonprofits take this to an extreme in which they basically said, no board member can post on social media, period, personal or otherwise. And I've seen that in the policy. And you know what? So someone wanted to post a pretty picture of a sunset by their house. They couldn't post it because of the board policy, So, part of the review that I was doing with this particular nonprofit was, well, as long as they can't post on behalf of the nonprofit organization, but they could post a pretty picture. But also going back to Chrystie, it is also important that, obviously, well, everyone's entitled to their personal opinions, but you need to look at how that person is posting. If they think the world is coming to an end, and COVID was a fake and everything else, you're like, is that a person I want on my board, or a volunteer or an employee? Yeah, something to consider at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to circle back around and say, the importance of responses, especially to comments from the community, it really should go through more than one person. And that's because we all have personal triggers, right? We all have things that trigger us to act or behave a certain way. We all have our buttons. And some of those comments could push one of those buttons or trigger you. And if there's only one person doing the responses, then you're more likely to have a knee-jerk comment reaction than something that is more on brand for your organization.
Yep. Okay, we're now going to sort of switch gears and talk about board recruitment and best practices. So we're going to talk about how do you do targeted recruitment, the package they should be given, the obviously recruitment process, onboarding, and how do you create a high-performing board. So what are you looking for in a board member? What does your board need to accomplish? What skills do you need? If you have an existing board, what are the current gaps? So with those, you really need to sit back and say, you know what, I have nobody with any financial acumen on my board. They're really good at, knowing the community and knowing who's who and who do we have to obviously work with, but I have no one with financial. So maybe that should be on your list. Maybe it would be obviously to your advantage to have someone with as an attorney or a legal background because of the nature of what you're doing. Maybe you're doing a lot of things with contracts or things with, that you'd have to be worried about discrimination or diversity or whatever in your organization. Understand what you need. If you have an existing board, evaluate the skills they have and what's missing. If you're creating a board, what are the skills that you need? Maybe you need someone who's really good at social media and understands marketing. And what the heck is the difference between posting on Facebook or X or LinkedIn? And who are those audiences that you should be doing? The other thing that's important in looking for a board is how hard will they work to help govern the organization? I was invited to come to a board meeting just to observe so I could help them obviously with moving on to different things. And there was one board member there that did nothing but text all throughout. They had their phone out and I could see it under the table, and all they would do was on their phone for the entire hour-plus meeting. And they barely said anything. And I'm just like, okay, are they really interested in being part of this board? So can you just trust someone's decision making? The people that, while you may expect a quorum, that each one of them, you have to be, they have to be knowledgeable in what you're making a decision on. Can you trust that? Is this person interested in your mission? If someone wants to deal with, the artistic community, but they don't have an artistic bone in their body and maybe not necessarily support it, are they the right person to be on your board? Nominating committee, I find this very interesting, that people's nominating committees sort of get going like a couple of months before the end of, obviously, people terms. Nominating committee should be throughout the year. You will meet people throughout the year, whether it's events that you're having, in the community yourselves, your local, obviously, where you live. That nominating committee should be constantly looking that if you're seeing a gap that you need filled, well, you know what? My neighbor knows social media. I wonder if they'd have some time for us. And maybe they don't want to do the board, but maybe they'll volunteer. So that should be part of what you're looking for. When you start recruiting, you really should have a recruitment package. And that should include everything, including mission and vision, your strategic plan, if you do have audit reports and an operating budget. Now, I will say before you start handing that out to anybody, have them sign a non-disclosure agreement, because you are sending out privileged and confidential information regarding your nonprofit that may not be known. Some nonprofits are large, so obviously they'll have their audit and budgets obviously published. If this is not public information, that person should sign a non-disclosure just to make sure that someone doesn't go around and say, oh, they're losing money, hand over to this, out there after the end of the day. You don't want that. Have those job descriptions. Have the time commitments and expectations, as we'd already talked about, as far as contributions and fundraising, whether that be time commitment for time or commitment for money. Give them a list of your existing board and staff and give them a brief bio so they have a comfort level who they're working with. You really should also have an application. And some people say, well, do I really need it? Well, no, because then actually on the application, it should also have a final statement on it that you can do a background check on me. Because I know some boards, especially some of the larger nonprofits, will do a full background check on their boards to make sure that the IRS is not after them or whatever the circumstances might be. Smaller boards don't do that. And then the other thing I would have is, for most boards, is you should have a board member agreement. And an example will be sent with the presentation. Because what it requires is that board member to sign the agreement to say, I will abide by the policies, procedures, bylaws, I will, and obviously I will attend the meetings. I won't miss more than 2, blah, blah, blah. And basically some agreements people temper down. I've seen some that says, okay, you're getting thrown off the board if you violate these. Others that'll say, you will be having a conversation with the chairperson and your future will be determined based on that conversation. So some of them temper the agreements, and that's fine. It goes back to how you need things and how you want things at the end of the day. How do you go through your formal recruitment process? Create a prospect list. That list should be created not only by the nominating committee, but also from the other board members. Hey, we're talking about someone with a financial background. I know so-and-so, and I had a brief conversation and they're interested in me putting on the list. Well, have that list. A board member should start the conversations. It's generally better to have a board member do it than the executive director or somebody else, because obviously the executive director reports to the board. So you should have another one, and then obviously provide them a copy of that board recruiting package, as well as obviously that the confidentiality agreement. Be frank. Don't say, oh, we are a great board. We always agree and we're all on the same thing. When their first meeting, you show up and all of a sudden you're having a battle over whatever topic it is. Let them know what they're walking into, because they're going to turn around and say, thanks, but no thanks. This is not what you told me. Tell them what your challenges are and what your strengths are. Be honest. If it's a facility that you have, give them a tour, have them interview with other board members, or be a guest at a board meeting or a portion of the board meeting. That's up to you. And then regardless of whether they say yes or no, always follow up with a thank you. Always. And Chrystie?
All right. So, onboarding these new members, it is really important to be consistent with the information that you're providing. And you have to remember that, that when somebody comes into a board orientation, they don't live in our nonprofit forest. So giving them all of the information that they need, all of the stuff that Karen just spoke about on the previous slide. You should have a consistent PowerPoint presentation that is given to every board member coming into to serve. That way they all know the same information. And it's going to have to be information about your organization and exactly what Karen just went into. Your strengths, your weaknesses, all of those kinds of things. Don't sell them. The worst thing that you could do is what Karen said, not be frank. Give them a false bill of sales, supposedly, right? Because you don't want them walking out after seeing disarray. You don't want them walking out and saying, this is not where I want to spend my time. So that board orientation is important to start everybody on a level playing field when they're coming into the board meetings. There should be an organization overview. You should be letting them know all of the staff members and letting them know how your organization is laid out. You should be sharing key documents with them. That strategic plan. They should know going in. Strategic plans are usually 3 years. So it's important for them to know what past board members have said and what policies and governances they've put in place, so that they can then carry the torch onto the next board member when their term ends. Fundraising plan, that is really important, because we have all different kinds of people on our boards. Some people like me, I jokingly refer to myself as a professional beggar. I will ask anybody for anything that's needed for the program. Other people have a really hard time at doing that. It just might not be in their wheelhouse. It might not be their personality to walk up to somebody. So make sure that that fundraising plan is given to them during that orientation period so that they know exactly what you're going to expect of them as a board member. The operating budget is also important. That kind of sets the stage because if there are big changes or if there are changes to that operating budget, more than likely the board is going to have to vote on that. So make sure that you provide them with the operating budget and that you explain all of the different items, the difference between a balance sheet and a P&L, so that they truly know what they're looking at. And can make those informed decisions because they're the ones that are tasked with making them. So make sure that they understand the data that you're providing to them and answer any questions that they might have on that. And then that board policy manual is just important so that they know and so that they have a reference point. You know, they might have a question. That board policy manual that you give them is going to, in most cases, answer that question. And sometimes they won't even actually ask that question because they don't want you to know that they don't know what the answer is. So having all of that information in a policy manual for reference is great for the incoming board. Some places even assign a mentor. As soon as you rotate onto a board, then a current board member or a board member that is that has experience is paired up with a new mentor, depending on what committee they've selected or however that agency is going to do it. But that mentor could also be a really good training tool for that new incoming board member. And then a lot of boards have an official 90-day review, just like we give to staff, you know, that probationary period. You should have a review period with your board members. They have new eyes, right? So they might see something that your current board does not, especially if you're doing what Karen had suggested and really recruiting for skills, for their talents, right? For the lawyer, for the accountant, those kinds of things. They're going to look at all of the board stuff through a different lens. So have that 90-day sit down with them. Find out how it's going. You know, do we need to get you more information? Do we need to have more reports? What is it that's going to help you stay informed and keep your pulse on what's happening in this agency so that you can be fiscally responsible?
And the one thing I would mention is I just did a board orientation for a nonprofit, and I was asked to do it because half the board turned over, but also some of the old board members fell into habits that were going off of and had challenges. So by having an independent person come in, and I went in and we went through the key policies. We didn't go through every bylaws, but we went through the key issues. We went through the requirements, you know, of a board. But everyone walked away hearing the same thing. And they were actually, that board was very appreciative of having that meeting because it allowed them to speak. And then we talked about a little bit about their future and what they wanted to do. And it was just an interesting, and it was a very dynamic orientation and a dynamic board. But I felt very comfortable at the end that they were on the same page. So that's part of the whole process at the end of it.
Absolutely. All right, so some characteristics of high-performing boards is that the board composition is intentional and not accidental. And that means that that there are criteria for the board. The board should represent the population that you're serving. The board should represent, have all of your geographical areas covered, because we all know what happens in Jasper is completely different than what happens in Hilton Head. That's completely different than what happens in Beaufort. So having board members from all parts of your service area is important. But and recruiting for the 3 T's, right? The time, talent, and treasure. Board composition is really should be intentional, and you should go after the skill sets that you are in need of. And when with accidental, it's not, we mean like some organizations, especially when they're starting out, they just want a board. So they don't have any criteria. They're going to let anybody on because they need to have a functioning board. That's more accidental, right? With those types of situations, you get what you get. You don't know that you're going to have an attorney on the board. You don't know that you're going to have somebody with a financial background. So make sure that the composition of the board and who serves on your board is very intentional, and that you represent the service population of your organization as well. It's always a great idea to have somebody that receives your services on your board. That way there's buy-in from, and there's a completely different point of view from somebody that needs your services. And that doesn't always happen, and it should. You should have all classes, all different classes at the table making these decisions, because these decisions that board members are making are important and can impact the community greatly.
Hey, Chrystie, we got a question that just in the spirit of, I know we're running at the end of the webinar here, but I wonder if we could address this one really
Sure.
from either. The question was, how can you avoid board member burnout? Those great members that are taking their jobs really seriously, but they say they've just had enough stress and maybe seeing that some others are not pulling their weight. You know, how do you kind of manage that?
I'm gonna let Karen, I'll let you answer it, and then I'll come around to the back end of it.
Absolutely. That is not, that is typical, is you've got this person who's gung-ho at the end of the day. Sometimes it's one of the founders of the nonprofit in the beginning, obviously, but at the end of the day, that goes back to showing roles and responsibilities of every board member. What's stressing out that board member? Is it, is it a balance between what they're doing in their personal life and the board? Or is it just because they do everything gets dumped on them? Well, you need to have that conversation with the person and say, listen, I don't want to lose you for the board if you're still committed. So what roles would you like to keep, and what do you want to get rid of? If you want to get rid of, then you look at those roles that you need to obviously find a new person to do. Then you've got to talk to all your other board members. You got to say, hey, this person no longer wants to prepare the budget, or they don't want to do fundraising, or they don't want to be knocking on the doors. Who's going to do that? And then that may mean that some of the other board members who are not willing to put their hands up to commit to that time, well, you could say goodbye to them, but obviously make sure you have someone there, and then start looking for somebody else.
Yeah, that burnout and fatigue is real, right? There has to be a balance. And I would say exactly, I would echo what Karen said and say that it's up to the chairman as well, the chairman of your board, to really identify and to see if that's happening. Maybe that person needs more people on their committee. In which case the chairman could say, hey guys, so we've had a whole lot of work on the fundraising committee. Is there anybody else that would like to step on here, because they're doing, the 3 ladies that are currently on here, it's just too much. So getting that individual, figuring out what is stressing that individual, because their passion can always be reignited But you have to make sure that you're taking care of them mentally, and that they have what they need to do the job that you're asking them to do.
And we're running out of time, Chrystie, so we got to start wrapping it up.
Oh, okay. So, members are engaged and committed. That goes back to Karen's example with the individual texting under the table. You know, are they engaged or are they just sitting there? Are they a member of your board because they believe in your policies, or are they a member of your board because they love seeing their name on your letter? Right? Find that question out. Agenda and materials are circulated in advance. Always. If you have a vote item, you should be getting that material to your board at least a week in advance of the actual vote item of the board meeting, so that they can make informed decisions and they can really think through all of the implications of those. Don't just put on the agenda a vote item and then hand them a piece of paper and expect them to be able to read and vote on that item at the same meeting, because a lot of times it won't happen. Focus on decision making, not status updates. Status updates can be sent out through a newsletter to the board. Right? You want to focus on action. When you have your board members, you want to be focusing on the action steps that need to be taken, not necessarily just on updates. And then that term limits and succession planning is also so important, because you always want those different lenses that people look through, but you also always have to be constantly reinfusing your board with new blood and with new passion for the work that you're doing, because it is absolutely contagious. With that, I'm going to throw it back to you, Karen.
Thank you. Just to wrap up the last few slides, and thank you for those who are hanging on with us for a few minutes after the hour. You know, questions you should ask going back to jumping to the other side before joining a board. Are you interested in the cause, and how much time do you have to devote? You know, it really can be very time consuming, and you need to be honest with yourself and who's recruiting you as to what you've got. Are you willing or able to assist with fundraising? Is that, again, understand your responsibilities, and is that part of it? Do you understand the roles and responsibilities? It goes back to, yes, whoever's giving you that board recruitment package should have that outlined. Are you willing to work with a team of people outside your usual professional or social circles? Sometimes the people are very uncomfortable. You know, as Chrystie mentioned, you know, she loves to knock on doors and ask for help. Other people are, you know, like, leave me alone. I can have one-on-one conversations, but don't put me in a room with 30 people. It's not my thing. Do you see an opportunity to make a difference in the organization? Honestly, I joined SCORE 6 years ago because I saw an opportunity that I could help the small business community here and nonprofits obviously be better at what they do. And I feel very passionate about that. And do you feel comfortable with the overall health of the organization? If you see a financial and you've got an issue, is this thing going to survive at the end of the day? And serving on a board is very rewarding. You know, there's a commitment for time, skills, and resources. So you really have to be evaluated by not only the prospective member, but also the organization at the end of the day. And with that, if there are there any last minute questions, Christine?
That was a good last call. Nothing hanging out there. But
Okay.
last call for
Right.
any final questions, and then we'll do a little quick snappy wrap up. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar. This is part of a series, as we mentioned. So same time, same bat channel next week, another great webinar, this time on marketing. And speaking of marketing, the Ezra Agency has one more of their webinar series for 2024. This one is on November the 5th, and the topic is marketing evolution, old platforms and new strategies. If you're not already a SCORE volunteer, we'd love you to become one. So please see the website link or any of us to sign up. Another huge thank you to our generous sponsor, Coastal States Bank. And SCORE is funded in part through a cooperative agreement with the Small Business Administration. All opinions, conclusions, and/or recommendations expressed herein are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the SBA. And lots of positive comments out there in the Q&A, just thanking you all for the information and the detail and appreciating your time. So thank all of you for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining
Thank
us, and come back next week or the week after or the week after. Thank you all. Bye now.
Everybody, bye.
Bye.